Hello. I'm Larry Horton, president of the Stanford Historical Society, and I welcome you to this Stanford History program. We are so pleased to have this program in this marvelous, elegantly renovated building in the Graduate School of Education. The moderator for today's program will be Geoffrey Cox. Geoff is a professor of the practice at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. Geoff earned his PhD in philosophy at the University of Chicago. He is an expert in higher education finance and governance. He has held positions as president of the Alliant International University, associate provost and budget director at the University of Chicago, and at Stanford, he was vice provost for institutional planning. He has also served as a commissioner on the Western Association of Colleges and Universities. This is the organization that accredits Stanford and other colleges and universities in the West. I also note that Geoff is a past president of the Stanford Historical Society. Geoff?
Thanks so much, Larry. Welcome, everybody. As a member of the GSE community, it's really my great pleasure to welcome you to this splendid new building, our new headquarters of the Graduate School of Education. I know many of you were our alumni of Stanford. And if you were an undergraduate here, you probably came into this building occasionally to take a final exam in chemistry or calculus or something like that. I hope you didn't have too much anxiety as you walk through the doors today. This was once a dark and fairly forbidding building that seemed designed to prevent people from actually meeting and talking with each other. I think you'll agree that it's been transformed into a welcoming space of light and beauty. This building, named for Angela Nomellini and Ken Olivier, its companion building across the plaza, which is named for Patricia and Jeff Rakes, together with the historic Barnum Building, have been designed to celebrate collaboration, community, and the joys of learning. We're very pleased to have you here, and we hope that you'll visit often. Given this setting, it's especially fitting that we have an all GSE panel today, and I'm delighted to introduce our speakers to you. Emily J. Levine is an associate professor of education and, by courtesy, of history. She is a graduate of Yale and received her PhD in history here at Stanford. Her research focuses on the history of higher education in both the United States and Europe. She is the author of, among many other publications, two important books, one called Allies and Rivals, German-American Exchange and the Rise of the Modern Research University, and the second book called Dreamland of Humanists, Warburg, Cassirer, Panofsky, and the Hamburg School, both of those books published by the University of Chicago Press. Mitchell Stevens is a professor of education and, by courtesy, of sociology. He is a graduate of Macalester College and Northwestern University, where he earned his PhD. As a sociologist, his interests range widely across the education spectrum. He's published books and articles on the homeschooling movement, on the impact of technology in education, on universities as centers of knowledge creation, on how students choose their curricular pathways in college, on alternative sources of work and learning across the lifespan, among other topics. I'm sure I've left out a few. He is a keen observer of innovations and trends in education and of the organizations that support them. Emily and Mitchell have collaborated for the past few years in both their teaching and writing, using Stanford's history as a lens through which to understand the evolution of higher education in the U.S. right up to the present moment. We're extremely fortunate to have them as our guides today. Welcome, Emily and Mitchell.
Thank you, Geoff Cox, for that warm introduction. You literally took some of the words right out of my mouth. And to Larry Horton and the Stanford Historical Society for giving the opportunity to us to share our work with you today. Geoff was saying, we have been collaborating for some time, bringing together my archive-based intellectual history with Mitchell's rich sociology and ethnography of elites and status and the organizational complexity of the sector. And I think when we're so bold, which for those of you who know us, we tend to be, we like to say that we are sort of in the midst of trying to develop what we call a new social science of universities. We've also been co-teaching this work as a class called Stanford and Its Worlds, which we'll offer again for the 4th time this spring, alongside the Stanford Archive Lab that we run in partnership with Stanford University Archives. Thank you to Josh Snyder and his team, who I see here today. So what you're hearing today, then, we should just say, is an outgrowth of really collaborative and ongoing project. And as Geoff was saying, it focuses on Stanford, not because Stanford is interesting in and of itself, I'm sorry to say, although it is that, but because, as we're going to argue today, it helps us make sense of a longer arc of a unique American political story. Right? And admittedly, we've also given talks and written aspects of this project that are a little bit further along. You can watch our talk on the academic social contract that was in the Dean's series of the Door School that we gave last winter, and read about that project. But we thought that we would take this opportunity, really in the spirit of intellectual creativity and energy, to share with you a work in progress. And so we're grateful to you for thinking together with us about it. And the premise here is that histories of higher education often begin in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And when they do, they often remain confined to institutional histories, to the exclusion of the outside world. And we're arguing that if we just change the kind of starting point of this story, as historians have a license to do, then we must shift our geographic center of gravity to Palo Alto. And in turn, we think that we change the story as well. Okay, so we're going to begin today with a puzzle, which is, how do modern democracies that are committed to egalitarian principles produce the political elites that are necessary to lead, unify, and inspire society? In other words, states require elites, yet it's the case that elites tend to seek to preserve their power. And so these facts are in tension with one another. This so-called, we might call this the problem of elites. It's sort of a classic problem in political theory, but it's also a practical one for modern societies committed to the principle of equality. Right? So in democracies, you can't vote for every civil servant. Hierarchies will necessarily emerge in a complex society like ours. So the question is, on what basis does that hierarchy emerge, and how is it justified? Right? And so to begin to answer this, before we get to Palo Alto, which I promise we will, we are going to use some help from a famous French political theorist, Alexis de Tocqueville, who traveled in America in the 1830s and was an astute observer of precisely this dilemma. And the first volume of Democracy in America contains several observations about the challenge that he saw America facing in distinguishing, cultivating, and legitimizing political elites. Passages like this one on the slide anticipate a kind of narrative of contemporary meritocracy. And indeed, as I was reading through this, one of my favorite works over the last week, I was struck by just how modern his observations sounded, right? That we would always be striving to achieve equality and just kill ourselves trying to get there and never quite achieve it. And he's also really quite good on anticipating the way that individuals will come to present themselves as elevating themselves at the same time that they serve others, right? Remember that. We'll come back to that. Now, he says this isn't a uniquely American problem. It's not a French problem either. It's a problem for modern societies. But Tocqueville couldn't anticipate the way that higher education would become to play an outsized role in the American expression of this problem. Later sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu and Max Weber would do so, and they would theorize precisely how educational institutions in a centralized state like France or Germany could be a mechanism for sorting and authorizing power, especially if the state funds and manages those educational institutions. But with a much weaker state, fragmented political power, and a natural distaste for elites, something like a Grande École or a University of Berlin, state-controlled, that so many Americans visited and admired, would be difficult to reproduce. And so the idea of a so-called national university is born early among the American founders as a desire to create a central institution that would unify the people culturally, produce political leaders, and project power onto the world. But where would you locate it, right? Like, where is the cultural center of early America? Is it Cambridge, Massachusetts? Is it Philadelphia, Pennsylvania? In fact, both of those were contenders, and they had their own champions, but there was certainly no consensus. And Washington was among the founders who called for an institution like they have in Europe, he said, right, to be a focal point for science, for enlightenment, and of course to train our leaders. And he even put aside money in his will for this to endow such an institution. But alas, despite support from Washington, from Madison, from other founders, many bills faltered in Congress over the series of a number of decades. And so while Americans consider one institution, they decline to found just one. The career of Thomas Jefferson can be seen in this context as an attempt to try to solve this problem, both conceptually and institutionally. Here, Jefferson offers Adams the idea of the natural aristocracy, whose legitimacy will be based on a different set of criteria from wealth and money and power, inherited money, namely virtue, right, and talents. Incidentally, Adams, on the other side of this epistolary exchange, which we don't see here, doubts Jefferson's solution. He says that all aristocracies, no matter on what they're based, will eventually become corrupt. And we can come back to this, perhaps at his prediction at the end, not to, no spoiler alerts here. But he tries, that is, Jefferson tries on several occasions to create such a European-style university that will cultivate the political elite that's necessary. Already in 1779, as governor of Virginia, he tries to reform the College of William and Mary with this purpose in mind, but to no avail. He tries to pass a public education bill in 1779 that lays the groundwork for the idea that educational institutions could be precisely these sorting mechanisms. And he even is so desperate that he tries to import the University of Geneva, following a revolution there in 1794, to bring such a European-style university to America. But it would take another 40 years to realize this goal, and it would be through the founding of the University of Virginia. And here, this is his design of the rotunda, that very distinctive building at the center of the campus that he made in 1819, courtesy of the Library of Congress. And this accomplishment of his to found this institution was so important to him that even on his grave, interestingly, it omits the fact that he's president, but says that he was founder of UVA, right? So important was it to him, again, that there be an institution that would replace clerical authority with with civic judgment, that would unify the North and South eventually, and of course, train Republican leaders. Okay, so this is on time. Yes, this is where we're headed, right? Our three kind of big points that we want to try out with you today, right? Over time, we want to argue, given this dilemma, Americans develop a peculiar system in contrast to Europe, whereby we don't have just the one institution, right? But universities compete with one another over contributions to state building, right? Who will play the bigger role in this project? And while Stanford was founded at the periphery of this system, savvy people use it as a resource for building hybrid careers. This is what we'd like to call academic statecraft. And in this process, they create a dense relational tissue linking Stanford and Washington that we experience down to today. So I'm going to turn it over in just a second to Mitchell, but I want to bring us up to Palo Alto as I promised, right? In which if we fast forward then to the end of the 19th century, a handful of other institutions on the East Coast, of course, have already followed suit in the model of UVA. Yale and Harvard have been transferring the idea of religious leadership to political elites, but now enter Leland Stanford, industrialist, philanthropist, and of course, political actor, right? He's already been governor, he's now even senator at this time. And as we know, Stanford doesn't just want to cut and paste what he sees in the Eastern schools. He will take what he sees and he will one-up them, right? Putting his own stamp on this endeavor. Stanford, as he tells the first graduating class, will be more practical. It will be engaged in useful knowledge, right? And as it says in the founding grant, the students will be compelled to promote the public welfare by exercising an influence in behalf of humanity, right? They would, in current parlance, right, have an impact, if you will. Now, by the end of the 20th century, Stanford and its offspring are now players in Washington, D.C. So the question we want to ask, that Mitchell's going to help us start to answer, is how does this happen? How did Stanford become central to the halls of power? And what does this say about American political development? Mitchell, over to you.
Thanks, Emily. I'm glad that you call out the title phrase that we use, American political development. That's a historical theory term. Has anybody heard of it before or used it? APD? APD? Yes. Okay, great. So I want to tell you a little bit about a little theory never hurt anybody, right? If you were like me in graduate school in the social sciences in the early 1990s and you were interested in politics and states, you would have been presented with the puzzle of why the United States has such a small, centralized, and relatively weak centralized government relative to the relatively strong and large centralized governments on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, the Germanys, the Frances, the Scandinavian countries, Great Britain. And it would have been explained to you that this was the case because of entrenched white racism, religious pluralism in the United States, a culture of individualism, a commitment to federalism, and the sheer geographic scale of the United States that made it very hard to coordinate a polity. And then if your political orientations were in this direction, you would end the term by looking longingly at the large centralized states of Northern and Western Europe that did such a different job of distributing collective assets. American political development was a response to that in the late 1990s. It was like, wait a minute, we can't say the United States had a small state. Like, didn't we wage World War II and the Cold War? Like, didn't we become globally preponderant as a state power? Like, how'd that happen exactly? Oh, and we may have a relatively small central state, but we sure have a lot of government in the United States. It's all over the place, right? There's government everywhere you turn. Yeah. Oh, I didn't turn. Oh, you're right. Thanks, Em. There was supposed to be that picture. Yeah, I'm not making this up, basically. And so APD was a recommend to say that, well, actually Americans do state differently. And by state, I just mean the organizational apparatus of a society, you know, building the organizational infrastructure that it takes to run a state is what I mean. And, Americans may have had a relatively small central government throughout the 20th century, but we did a lot of state building through organizations that don't look, sound, feel like, or act like government, all right? We build a lot of state capacity through organizations that aren't officially government. Here's your signal. Every time you see an organization that is a not-for-profit organization, it's a little signal that it's being underwritten by the American people and the government, right? If you're assembling your taxes now to figure out, what your deductions are going to be, right? That's because you have engaged in state building, right? For all those checks that you sent, however large, however small, and the federal government and the state of whatever state you're in sort of recognize your contribution to civic capacity by recognizing that in your taxes. So, and so that is one of the most important ways in which Americans built out a spectacular state capacity without necessarily building out something that felt or was experienced as government. So you might see where we're going here today. It turns out that colleges and universities are very important mechanisms of state building in the United States. And part of the reason there are so many of them is because they're kind of Swiss Army knives of state building. You can do all sorts of different things with college founding. So let me give you just one example. But if you went to a college or university in the United States, right, and you have any inkling of its history, you might think about that school when in your mind. Let me introduce you to one school in a Colorado college in Colorado Springs. In the early 1870s, the railroad magnate William Jackson Palmer founded the new city of Colorado Springs, coterminously with donating 20 acres for a college. The city doesn't yet exist, but by co-creating a college for it, Palmer sure hopes to increase the odds that it will soon exist, right? There's a big frontier, there's no internet, there's very little photography. How do you signal to people out east that your place is the one they should move to or invest in, right? Well, you build churches, you build schools, you build town squares. Hopefully you get a railroad stop, right? College founding was an important way of what geographers call placemaking, right? We exist, we will be here, right? Now, Palmer was not alone among 19th century developers in founding and using colleges as this form of creating a place, no question about it. It's also clear to sort of recognize that, school founders, religious zealots, right, and capitalist entrepreneurs could all be one and the same person, right? You didn't have to choose between settling the West, saving native peoples, which was a really good way to raise money back east if you were promising to educate and Christianize native peoples, right? You could be all of these things at once. And it's as if the founders of these schools were saying, God has ordained this, we will build it, you will notice, and you might come. So, there goes this beauty, right? I mean, one of the things we know about Leland and Jane Stanford was that they were ardently religious people, they were extraordinarily ambitious people, they were political people, and they were philanthropists, right? Why do one of those things when you can do all three at once? And so that's what we mean by colleges and universities as state-building vehicles. And that's the legacy that we want to try and plumb and see what Americans did with that tradition over the course of the 20th century. Emily got us to 1895, and we're going to try and bring you to the late 20th century. So how do we do this? Well, we are truly multi-method here. We are primarily historian. Well, we're entirely historians in this work. We're looking at Stanford across the 20th century. We're interested in it because it's a late arrival to this project of creating political elites. But by the end of the 20th century, we're doing pretty good producing political elites. So how do we get from the periphery to near the center of Washington over the course of the 20th century? We do this substantially through secondary research, but also original archival research by a wonderful doctoral student here in the GSC named Abby Khan, who gets credit for the hard work in the archives. And the project focuses on 3 people working at different moments in 20th century history, but we're only going to talk about 2 because we figured if we tell you how the movie ends, then why would you show up after the trailer? So I'll turn it over to you, Emily.
Yeah, this is what we do. This is our kind of dog and pony show. That's why I had to come, even though, as you can tell, I'm a bit under the weather, but we're a package deal. So our account then begins with none other than Herbert Hoover, whose climb to the position of President of the United States was characterized by a movement between the government and a return to his alma mater, Stanford, his movement back and forth between these 2 spheres, which we argue marks an early instance of what we're calling academic statecraft. Now, as many of you know, Hoover came from humble beginnings. He was orphaned as an early child in West Branch, Iowa. He enters Stanford's inaugural class, even failing the entrance exams for the school. And I mean, this is an important part to pause and to reflect on. The Stanfords had created this category of a special student, what we might call today a non-traditional student, to permit entrance of precisely such a figure who hadn't attended the right schools or even passed the exams. It was kind of a risk that they took, even faced critiques that they were lowering standards, but they were committed to reaching a wider audience. And so at its founding in 1891, Stanford is a kind of contradiction, right? It's both a monument, a monument dripping in the Gilded Age, right? And it is, a civic, a gift to the children of California. Now, of course, Hoover wasn't a Californian, but he still exemplified this kind of meritorious commoner on whom Leland and Jane Stanford stacked the school's legitimacy. And his ascent as a white man from a small town in Iowa and a modest household reflected a broader transformation in the early 20th century when higher education was helping to expand entrance to the political elite of the United States. So upon graduation, Hoover turns to work as a mining engineer, and it's a career that takes him across continents as far as Asia. He maintains, though, close ties to Stanford. He joins the board of trustees in 1912. And when World War I comes, right, he just is already in Asia, and he arrives in Europe, ready to work to organize a massive humanitarian operation across Europe, directing US food relief. And he's able to do this because he moves easily between the spheres of business as an engineer, academia as a trustee, and then and government as well. One of you submitted a question in advance about how our work compared with the work of Becky Lowen on Hoover, and that was a very astute observation or pre-question. We are, in fact, of course, drawing on her excellent work, which I think uses Hoover to show how expertise and democracy are kind of reconciled in a new voluntarism or voluntary associationism. In this common commission for relief in Belgium, it's one of these like nonprofits. It's an independent, nominally neutral institution, yet it's feeding 10 million people, right? And Hoover gets the job to run it because of his technical expertise. And if Lowen is emphasizing the new structure of voluntarism that this represents, we're emphasizing that Hoover represents a new class of political elites in this role. And it's around the same time that he founds the Hoover War Collection at Stanford. He donates all his documents on the relief effort to this new library collection, right? And he shows that Stanford and this Hoover of the War Collection, this Hoover of the Belgian relief, is part of this growing world where expertise and public authority now increasingly overlap, right? And Stanford allows them to overlap and allows him to pave the way for his eventual rise to the presidency from 1929 until 1933. And he will, of course, return the favor, accepting the Republican nomination from the modest Stanford football stadium in his professional and in his personal home. Now, the third moment of Hoover that we want to emphasize before moving on to our second figure is when he, after losing his bid for a second term, he makes the decision to return to Stanford as a base of his operations. And over the next few decades, he builds up that war collection into the Hoover Institution, an independent institution within the frame of Stanford University. And so in doing so, he helps to build a new type of hybrid institution, one that exists both inside the university and in the broader realm of national politics, right? Legitimizing this new model of elite political participation that he represents. And so you could see in this way that Hoover is kind of an ideal home and an institutional parallel to this academic statesman and our category of academic statecraft. Because higher education would be more than a credential now. It was now serving as a career pathway to something like state mobility, a lifelong association with the university that opens the doors to influence and power. But critically, the last point I'll just emphasize is that Hoover was never only self-serving, nor only promoting his own career. Rather, much like Leland Stanford, he manages to do both at the same time, right? Humbly acting like a civil servant or a humanitarian manager, and advancing, of course, his career. And so he fulfills the Stanford's vision for a self-made, civic-minded man, and then paves the way for others to follow.
When I started teaching MBA students at Stanford, I often learned, not uncommonly, people would say, well, my first career is going to be in X, but I want my second career to be in education, say, right? Well, Hoover had a first career as a mining engineer, and he did not become mega wealthy, but he certainly became quite affluent. And Hoover Institution is ultimately his gift to Stanford. So in a sense, Hoover himself had several careers, right? Yeah. And we're going to introduce another. One of the questions also was, there's a lot of emphasis about Stanford's ties to Washington for World War II and Cold War technology development. We're sort of adding or complementing to that on the sort of more explicitly civic and political side. So I'm going to introduce you to someone you may not yet know, and it's fitting that we're here in the Ed School. So Hoover exemplified a visible kind of statecraft, but there were a lot of people doing state building who were sort of very influential, but perhaps less visible. So here's another Iowa native, this guy, Paul Hanna, who's born to a Methodist minister in Sioux Falls, Iowa, goes to Hamlin College in St. Paul and is enamored of the president of Hamlin and the idea of an academic career. He did his PhD at Teachers College, Columbia, and joins the Stanford faculty in 1935. Here he is in his, also like Herbert Hoover and his wife Lou Henry Hoover, Hanna and his wife built a home on the Stanford campus designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, which also becomes a gift to the university. Now, Hanna's expertise in elementary civics education does not you wouldn't think that would set him up to be, a kind of mover and shaker in Washington. But in fact, it does happen, right? So first of all, he makes a non-trivial, he becomes affluent enough to commission Wright to build a home for himself by writing and publishing textbooks, much like Elwood Cubberley, who also gave a gift to Stanford, this building, which was paid for in large measure by his private wealth. Now, while this is happening, the Hanna years, before the World War II starts, Stanford is struggling through the Great Depression. And one of the things that universities figure out really, really quickly is if you can get the federal government to be your client, that's really good, right? war is really good for academic business, especially in the United States, because we had a weak centralized state. Remember APD. World War II mobilization requires so many resources to mobilize. Colleges and universities raise their hand and say, we can help with that, right? Military mobilization, scientific training, and this happens all over the United States, but it was easier for some schools than others, right? Stanford in the 1930s and early 40s is still a 5-day train ride away from Washington, right? So it's harder to get those contracts. So Hanna and his colleagues figure out that wouldn't it be great if someone resided part-time in Washington and would hang out at the Cosmos Club with federal officials and maybe broker contracts for wartime projects that he could take back to California. And that's exactly what he did. In fact, Hanna got so good at this that Time magazine covered him for a story in the early 1940s and described him as Stanford's ambassador to the US government, right? He would have had a lot of frequent flyer miles. I don't know if the railroads do that, but you know, another, again, a sort of toggling back and forth between Washington and Stanford in the service of creating capacity for government. So now, once the war ends, remember Hanna's an educator. He then sees that education might be a very powerful tool of peacetime statecraft and foreign policy. So let's just say he's instrumental in creating the field of international development education, which Stanford is still a signal program at Stanford, now called international education. This is Hanna assembling a bunch of curricular resources for students in the Philippines. Which of course has a complicated relationship to U.S. empire at the time. So again, you may not have heard of Hanna, but there were dozens, scores, hundreds of Hannas, we suggest, working across the country at the interstices of government and academia to create a kind of hybrid institutional order in which the boundary between federal government work and academic work becomes increasingly blurry. Now, of course, the story keeps going, right? You may be personal friends, right, with some of the men and women who continue to carry out this tradition. And in the work that we're continuing to develop, we're arguing that this is what we mean by a sort of gradual accretion of relationships, right? There's Senator Stanford, President Hoover, technocrat Hanna, right? And then over time, those webs of relationships and reciprocal joint ventures accumulate, so much so to create an institutional order that then can support its own careers, right? That's the 20th century state, right? But Stanford both helped to create and inherits as part of its legacy.
Great. Thanks, Mitchell. So we only gesture to kind of the final chapter, but as we said from the beginning, we're not just telling kind of a fun story, though we hope you're enjoying it. We also are trying to make a historical argument here. And we've tried to sort of argue, I think, three things. That first, that a distinct competitive ecology results from the American response to what we began by calling the problem of elites. And it's a response that's different from how this plays out in Europe. I think it's more porous, it's more fluid. It certainly does create the opportunity for many more institutions.
Reclining.
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm. And more individuals. And so, and this happens because, and this is our second piece of our argument, that institutions will compete and cooperate with one another to move closer to the center of political power. This we call elsewhere competitive emulation. That's that, not copy and pasting, but one-upping that we see as a unique kind of competition that happens in higher education, but not necessarily among political nations or in economic markets. And third, and I think this is really important, that public service and personal ambition are coextensive. So, again, remember, take our friend Leland Stanford, as we like to tell our students at the beginning of Stanford and its Worlds, or rather pose to them the question, was Leland Stanford a magnanimous philanthropist who out of the good of his heart wanted to educate the children of California? Or was he a swindler who, laundered his money on stolen land? Yes, right? He was both, as we like to say, right? He wasn't either, certainly not exclusively. He was a complicated human being, and it's that complexity that I think we're trying to capture with this new hybrid structure of this political elite that I think really is elevated when we shift the story to the frontier. Mitchell?
And the creation also of a distinctively American kind of subjectivity, which we call public servant. Oh, he's a public servant, right? Which is a mark of honor, right? He may be many things, she may be many things, but she's a servant, right? And I think we want to posit that kind of subjectivity was a cultural form that Americans evolved to help sort of manage this tension.
And it may be one of the reasons this duality that leaves these elites and these institutions open to critique.
So something started happening in 2016 to change this conversation. You might recall that in the second year of the Trump administration's first presidency, they pushed and successfully levied a very modest excise tax on private colleges and universities that had a certain scale of endowment per student. And Emily and I wrote a piece in the New York Times saying, pay attention to that, because over the course of the last century, right, the nation's elite, private, highly selective, and frankly wealthy schools have been framed as servants of the federal government, right? They have been master solutions to the problems that are facing the United States. And here they're being regarded as nuisances to be disciplined, all right? Think about that, we said in this paper.
Yes.
Right? Well, you know what happened next, right? We get a second Trump administration. And Harvard University wakes up one morning and perhaps like a spouse, right, whose partner tells them in the marriage they thought was happy, right, that it's ending tomorrow, right? That the relationship between the federal government and elite private universities as being very dramatically redefined and renegotiated. And it's our hope, and this is where we'll end this, that our work provides some purchase on the depth and potential depth and potential consequence of what is being negotiated between Washington and universities today.
Exactly, yeah, and we would like to end with these provocations, but I'll just add that in the spring, as the battle between the federal government and Harvard was playing out in the courts, I was stationed as an ambassador from the GSE to Stanford in Berlin, where I had the privilege of being the faculty in residence. And it's a city where I've spent a lot of time researching and writing about German universities. And everywhere I went in academic and social circles, people kept saying, like, what is your government doing? Why? We can't understand. Why would it be that you Americans, you stole our model and you perfected it, and now your government is dismantling it? Like, why on earth would you do that? Why would you undermine, this great asset? I mean, like, the Europeans just could not get their heads around this. So we come back, I think, again to this peculiar American sort of expression of this story, and want to ask, and perhaps we can think together, how it is that the joint venture among universities and government rendered universities more vulnerable, more fragile, more exposed in our current moment. How do their prestigious academic affiliations and national service orientation both help and hinder American elites today? And given the contingency of the story that hopefully we helped to expose, what kind of academic statecraft might be possible and prudent for Stanford, its leadership, and other institutions like it to pursue at this moment. And we'll end there with questions we have no intention of answering.
Right.
Well, thank you both, Emily and Mitchell. That was a great lesson and nice to see Stanford at the center of the story. I'm not going to let you off the hook, though. I mean, you provoked us with these provocations, and I think that we're all anxious to get your views on sort of how you read this current political moment. And let me maybe make it a little bit more specific. I mean, Mitchell, you said the marriage has come to an end. Why? I mean, is it because one side was playing around, or was there...
Or maybe coming to an end.
Maybe coming to an end. So maybe you can give us a little bit more insight into that. And I think maybe more importantly, do you have any sense of kind of what the long-term implications? Do you think this is just a kind of short-term disturbance in a pattern, or is there something more at stake here?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer to your second question, on my view, is no. I think this is going to... We don't go back from here, right? What forward looks like is the question. My read on the current moment is that, remember in the first Trump administration, you heard things about the deep state. Remember that? Deep state stuff, okay? This guy is a brilliant observer of elites, right? And we are telling you a story about a densely networked web of a small number of people who, in fact, have been educated in a small number of schools, who have built careers, building relationships with each other at the interstices of academia, government, and corporate America. I mean, the Epstein files give you a clear sense, right, of how reciprocally implicated all of these different elites are, okay? And the thing to think about also with Donald Trump, one of the things we know about him is how jealously he watched New York establishment elites over the course of his entire career, all right? This guy gets it, right? And so he also came to get just how powerfully resentment against extraordinarily wealthy people could be at a moment in which four-year college degrees had come to essentially divide the country into two. All right, so I think he was a keen observer of the same phenomena that Emily and I are trying to explain, and he also recognized that truth, right, could be mobilized as a target for men and women who are very far removed from that world and who are, by virtue of various features of American higher education, its exquisitely competitive admissions rates for the elite schools, the extraordinary wealth of a small number of schools, and frankly, the temerity of a school saying, we're rich, we don't admit your kids, you're welcome, right? That the narrative of service that we developed at a different point in American political history is just kind of harder for these institutions to sustain by virtue of the character that they came to have relative to the larger institutional order by the second decade of the 21st century.
Yeah, I think that I'm a historian at heart, so historians tend not to have crystal balls, for the future. But I think, and but I do think it's tempting to say we've never been here before. Historians always like to say, yes, we have. Tell you why, And I think, we've tried to show you what's new about this moment, I think, right? The fact that the universities are seen now not as partners, but as opponents, that's certainly new. But I think what the history of higher education does show us, and I write about this elsewhere, is that its history is a kind of one of sustaining innovation. So oftentimes there is a challenge that appears to be something that will never get around. And in the beginning, that was the research institution itself. America was a land of colleges at first, but it was because of the competitive market of research institutions at Europe that savvy institutional innovators figured out how to co-opt that competition, hybridize it, and turn it into the institution. Now that model has been a bit of a liability because Trump has been waging really what is a culture war against education. And the only way to get at education is through research. And of course, education and research are linked in the university. And so he can pull, the purse strings there, right? And that's absolutely what he's done. And so in that hybrid between research and teaching has now become a liability. For me, then the structural question is, what new institutional hybrids will emerge in response to precisely that attack?
Yeah, and when I said we don't go back, that is not to say I don't know where we're going. I think that is the job of educational entrepreneurs now. What's the next move? Right? That to me is the existential
And I think
question.
it's important to remember that we have this history of innovation, that we're constantly creating new institutional types that come and respond to problems of the moment. So I agree. I'm going to ask one more question and then I'll open it up. So get ready if you have a question, but maybe Emily, I'll direct this first to you. Among other things, it seems to me that these elites that you're talking about have managed over most of this history to carve out a privileged space of free speech, freedom of ideas, and have been able to be sort of Socratic gadflies for the country at large. That also seems to be sort of coming under a lot of pressure. Do you have some thoughts on where we stand with that?
Yeah, so I think does this go back? Yeah, so for this one, I would also take us back, okay, to that founding grant, right? Because I think here is where the contradiction emerges that we're feeling the repercussions from today, which is that institutions like Stanford demanded autonomy, right? And wanted space for precisely that role as criticism without the meddling, to develop their expertise in the new social sciences. And yet, what does expertise do? But meddle. That's precisely its purpose, right? And what was the institutional goal of Stanford, which very much epitomized the sort of hope and promise of the new social sciences of this moment? It was precisely to produce useful knowledge. Wait for it, right? To improve humanity. Now, this works when everybody agrees on what that looks like. But as we know, and I spoke about in this series for the Stanford Historical Society a couple of years ago, Edward A. Ross had a different idea of what improving society looked like than Jane Stanford did, right? And when Jane Stanford tries to silence him, she, as many of you know, right, she gives many talks saying, Stanford's not a political institution. It was never meant to be political. What? This coming from the wife of the
railroad magnate,
governor and
governor of California,
senator, right? For whom this was precisely about wielding political power, right? So I think the way I see this, and this is the subject of my new book on academic freedom, so you can have me back to discuss it, in 6 months to 18 months to 3 years, right? Which is that I think you can see kind of the history of this problem also as one of kind of this kind of modus operandi where we have a kind of agreement about what those boundaries are, and then external crises kind of enter in order to undermine that equilibrium. Formulas are reconceived, boundaries are redrawn, and then we move kind of to another, there's a détente. And I think we are clearly in one of those moments now. And we haven't yet figured out what the new boundaries are going to be and what the narrative will be that will create space for the next version of the sort of university gadfly.
All right, so I failed to get any predictions out of them, but you all can try. Anyone have a question they'd like to pose? And please stand up and...
Yeah, stand up, please.
I'm sorry, don't do this lady right here in the front. Can we get a mic very quickly to her?
Hold it.
And
Okay. Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was very enticing and timely. I immediately thought about, a lot of us came from the business school, and then our second and third careers were into the public service. So for instance, a lot of us had worked with USAID on projects overseas, starting businesses and a lot of development. And you see this, what happened to USAID. They just cut it off at the knees. So it's not just academic, it's everywhere. Health, all our health research has been just cut off at the knees. Education, business, reaching out to the rest of the world. This is what I feel like the US, America, was known for. We cut off the immigrants, we're making them into savages with this administration. This seems just like somebody that's taking over what our principles, our founding principles were, and just distorting everything and going back to someplace else. So I don't see it just in education, I see it everywhere. And I wonder how other people feel that.
I like what you said, Nancy, because you just not reminded me, you made me see that this kind of character, this subject of public service, is actually way more pervasive, right? Like it's sort of baked into what a way in which we think about, like, be it responsible use of my education, right? I think it's useful to remember that this system and its culture that we talk about really did coalesce in the middle of the 20th century, which was a peculiar time in American political economy, right? Going to college itself was exceptional, right? Well into the third decade of the 20th century, right? We were fighting a global Cold War in which there was general consensus among elites that the United States was on the right side of that conflict, right? We were trying to purvey a particular version of American civil society, right, that was contrasted with other options on board. So there was like a whole political world was brought into existence, right, that I grew up in, right? That world no longer exists, right? The institutional architecture underneath that world no longer exists, right? What we have to do now is sort of take the features of that world, right, somehow respond to the categorical challenge, right, that that American populism is bringing, right, and consider what the next chapter of that social form is, right? That's a huge task, but I think it's a way more interesting and important than trying to defend or preserve, which doesn't really help us, change what needs changing.
Jonathan Gifford is monitoring questions coming in from online.
There's one in the back in the corner.
Yeah, we'll catch this gentleman.
So yeah, this being a historical society, we got a question about the origins of Stanford University and the founders' focus on bringing so many native Californians to the university. And were they just thinking about California, or did they have a view to creating national leaders?
Ooh, I wish that
in
we
the
had
1890s. Yeah.
I wish we had our image of the early options for the Stanford seal that Josh Snyder helped us and our student Max Nakve dig up, because I think it captures the kind of multiplicity of the ambition really, really nicely. I mean, the idea of kind of embedding the kind of sequoia, with the semper virens, the redwood tree,
only here,
right? Only
in
this native to California, right? Into the kind of traditional seal, already recognizable as the institutional sort of iconography of the East Coast. Also with the German, right? Oh, where's my bag down there from Stanford in Berlin? Die Luft der Freiheit weht, right? The wind that freedoms blow, right? Which, of course, as Gerhard Casper has researched and told us, was a Latin phrase translated back into German, precisely to kind of make this bid for cultural sort of relevance. Like, we are like those institutions that are the center of knowledge in Germany. So I wouldn't say that it's just California. I think the whole point was it was meant to be, in California, part of a longer tradition in America and Europe and of the world.
Thank you. And now in the back.
Thank you very much for your superb presentation. I'd like to hear your perspective on the additional baggage that universities carry or are perceived to carry today that probably is impacting their relationship with Washington as well as with the general public. This baggage includes rampant anti-Semitism and the inability to deal with it effectively, widely reported cases of research misconduct that have led to prosecutions under the Federal False Claims Act, dramatically increased cost of attendance that has greatly outrun the rate of inflation over the past 50 years, a diminution of the quality of the academic product due to grade inflation, and the deepening influence of countries of concern on the university system here, such as massive financial contributions by Qatar at the Northwestern University, widespread influence by China, and theft of intellectual property by China and other countries doing research here or funding research here or sending graduate students here. How do universities deal with all of this baggage while presenting a narrative to prevent throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
I'm gonna try parsimony here, all right? So what you call baggage, I would call complexity, right? Universities are places where astrophysics, art history, anesthesia, sex and courtship, and Olympic volleyball all happen simultaneously in the same physical places, and we completely naturalize that, right? There's a lot of complexity in these enterprises, okay? The big thing, that complexity has only grown over the last 50 years. No question about it, right? What we've lost, I'll say we, the inside, we've lost opacity, right? By which I mean things that happened within the walls of the university, right, are now highly visible to the outside world by virtue of any kind, again, the Epstein case is a perfect example of that, right? The opacity enabled complexity to happen, all sorts of elaborate cross-subsidy, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, pay Peter, buy off Paul, right? Like, you know, are universities more or less corrupt now than they were in 1950? I don't know. I know they're more complicated, and I know they're much easier to observe by outsiders than they were, right? And it's that the collapse of opacity that, coupled with the complexity, that makes the challenge of maintaining the legitimacy of these enterprises just way harder than it was before.
Very interesting. I think we have maybe time for one or two at the most, if it's a short question. Couple, sir?
As a child of the 60s, when I was an undergraduate here, the relationship between the university and the government was a highly charged issue. And the president of the university at the time, Mr. Lyman, said that universities just aren't set up to deal with this kind of stuff. You know, people throwing firebombs in the windows and that kind of thing. So there were rules set up kind of separating out the university from the government, and getting rid of things like Stanford Research Institute and stuff like that. Did all those reforms kind of go away when the Vietnamese War went away and it just went back the way it was? Or do the reforms continue? And Stanford seems to be less a target than other universities. Is that because of
Have you noticed that? Discuss, right?
Do those reforms continue here, and do they protect Stanford now, or where are we with this?
Yeah.
I think here is where perhaps our framework of the academic social contract is somewhat useful. And again, I'll rely on kind of the historian's view to say, I would never argue that we go back, but I think that we see cycles of these crises and responses in which we have new iterations.
Chronic tensions.
Yeah,
right?
chronic tensions. And so if we like to talk about, we have talked about the university as engaging in a kind of academic social contract with the federal government, in which it gets the patronage as well as the prestige and status that we've been talking about today, and the academic freedom that we mentioned, in exchange for providing services for society. And that's defined differently in different moments over the course of the history. First it's going to be research. Yes, research for wars, and that becomes controversial and the point of one of the controversies, right? Then it's going to be cultivating individuals for citizenship. But for some people that means teaching students the importance of voting, and for others that means giving them the right to protest, right? So I think, again, here is, as Mitchell said, as that relationship's gotten more complex over time, the institution has embedded itself more and more in the political and social world outside its walls, right? Saying, no, we get this autonomy because we do all of these things for you. We've sort of tied ourselves up into a kind of a contradiction, because, again, nobody agrees on exactly what that looks like, right?
Yeah, great. One more question, I think. Sir, been patient.
And we'll stick around for a while too and take other questions.
Yeah, thanks very much. I was just wondering if there were historical lessons to be learned from the operations of universities in other countries under autocracies, because that seems kind of where we're headed.
Absolutely.
Talk about dropping the mic here.
Absolutely. I think that, first of all, this is out of my ken, right? If we talk afterwards, I could direct you to some men and women who are better equipped than than I am. But it is the case that here's the thing. Here's one of the fascinating things about universities. There is no modern state without a university, right? Universities are constitutional features of the civic and political architecture of every modern state. Sometimes they're even virtually completely subsidized by the state, right? As is the case in Germany and elsewhere. But here's the thing. If the state controls the university too much, it ceases to be a university, right? And so both states, if they're not going to be autocratic, right, states need universities to have independence, right? And so you're absolutely right to look at other countries and to see that this is a pattern. It's playing out differently in different autocratic countries, but that to me suggests just how deep the stakes are here, right? And again, there's no going back. The question is, what does forward look like?
Let's leave it at that.
Emily and Mitchell, thank you so much.
Really, it's a great pleasure to have such a wonderful program here, and I want to thank very much Emily and Mitchell for those excellent presentations. I think we're going to hear a lot more about academic statecraft in the future. Thanks to Geoff for moderating, and special thanks to two people who did a lot of hard work in making all this come together at the event, but it's all in the background. And that's Jeannie Crumley-Cole, Director of Content and Communication Unit, and Caroline Statsulat, the event coordinator who helped arrange all of this. Now, just a few comments about the Stanford Historical Society. The Historical Society, shortly after its founding, set up an oral history program to record and place in the university archives oral histories of key Stanford faculty, students, officers, and participants in important university events. As part of our 50th anniversary celebration, which is going on right now, our oral history program has prepared and posted on our website 50 stories curated around such themes as research discovery, student traditions, famous visitors to Stanford, and some earth-shattering moments. On the screen is one of the stories, the visit of Mikhail Gorbachev to Stanford in 1990. In this short less than 5-minute video, you will see fascinating glimpses of the highlight of that historic period. There are already 20 stories all online and more to come. You will find them enlightening, insightful, interesting, and some quite amusing. We also put out every year, the Historical Society publishes 3 times a year, a journal, Sandstone and Tile. I got my copy yesterday in the U.S. mail, and it's online in the library and on our website. This unusual cover shows a pile of Stanford hats, including recreations of plug uglies from Stanford in the late 19th century and early 20th century. You might ask what one would do today with such weird hats. Well, join us, because I wanted to tell you a bit about the Historical Society and invite you to join us. We are part of Stanford University, but we are not directed by any university department or officer. We're an organization of volunteers. We are governed by a board of directors, which is elected by the members of the society. We have both faculty and students and alumni and neighbors who are just friends. All of our work is done through 8 standing committees of volunteers. Anyone is eligible to join us, and all are welcome. Membership dues and occasional grants from the university support the work of the society. The leadership and the bulk of the work of the society is done by unpaid volunteers. For example, our speakers today are spectacular.
It's our civic gift.
So if you're interested in learning more about us, please join us. We have one other public historical event this quarter, Historical Society event, and that's going to be on March 5th. The Stanford University Archives will be open for visits to special showings of rare historical items related to Stanford history. Because of the need to protect these precious documents, we can only meet a limited number of people at a time. All are welcome to apply. Information on applying, on how you can get to this program, will be on our website later this year. Looking ahead to the spring, we have 2 blockbuster programs. Information on these events will be, of course, coming in the coming weeks. For all those watching online, and that is a greater number of people are watching this online than are here in person, please check out our website, the stanfordhistoricalsociety.edu, for more information about how you can join us. And for those of us who are here, let us now all adjourn and join the reception in the lobby of the building with our faculty members here for refreshments and conversation. Thank you all for joining us. One thing, I meant to have copies here, but there are copies of a nice card about this building that will give you can take your own self-tour about the building. And so that will be there. And there's also information on how you join the society downstairs. Thank you so very much.